Happy New Year and hi folks from Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria. Now this is a slightly different video, something a bit different from my channel, and we're going to be talking here about the subject of archaeology, history and Graham Hancock. That's right, so like many of you over Christmas, I've been taking a bit of a break. I've been a little bit ill and I've had lots of family things to do and other work as well, so I've been taking a little bit of a step away from videos, and that's meant I've actually been able to catch up a bit with some of my watching. And one of the things I've watched is Graham Hancock's series on Netflix, which I suspect that probably thousands of you have also watched or are intending to watch at some point. And you may be aware that this has been a very, very controversial series. Graham Hancock goes by many descriptions. He's been described widely as a pseudo-archaeologist. He himself has widely stated that he hates being called a pseudo-archaeologist, but nevertheless that is a term that has been applied to him. Now he's not an archaeologist, he's not a historian. By his own admission, he is a journalist, okay? So he came at this and wrote a series of books, primarily in the 90s that I grew up with. So I became an archaeology student in the 90s and I graduated in the year 2000. So I was aware of his books, I read some of his books, and they're great entertainment. That's the first thing to say about them. They're great entertainment, and that's why I wanted to watch the Netflix series, which is also great entertainment. The slight difference here is that I am a former archaeologist. Now, the way that this has been painted in the media, and if you look at things like Russell Brand's channel or something like that, is very much Graham Hancock versus the archaeologists. Well, do you know what? I am not Graham Hancock and I am not an archaeologist, but I have been an archaeologist. I did work as well briefly as an archaeologist after graduating. But I do consider myself a form of historian, whether you consider me a professional or an amateur or a hobbyist historian, whatever. The fact is I do primary source history research and have done for 30 years. So by my measure, I am a form of some type of historian, even if I don't make my primary living out of it now, although you could say I run a history-based YouTube channel, so from that point of view, maybe I am a historian. I don't know. I'm a YouTuber. But I am also an antique dealer, and I also do historical research as part of my job as an antique dealer. I've worked as head of arms and armour at a London auction house, and I am a professional limited company director of an antique dealing business, and I do historical research as part of that as well. So I consider myself a historian. So I don't consider myself exactly on the Graham Hancock camp, definitely, and I'm not really on the archaeologist camp, although I'm probably well more towards the archaeologist camp than the Graham Hancock camp. But nevertheless, I have some views which I thought might be interesting to some of you to share, and something a bit different for the channel, a bit off topic for my normal content, on this whole Graham Hancock versus archaeology issue. So the first thing that really bugs me about Graham Hancock's stance and perspective and approach to presenting his topics, I'm not going to talk about the content here, I'm not going to talk about whether I agree or disagree with various things he says specifically, but overall is he often paints archaeology as the enemy and somehow the wall that he's trying to break down and you know, the opposition. And there's a fundamental problem with this. If you watch the Netflix documentary or you read any of Graham Hancock's books, here's the problem. A huge amount of his content, whether it's on screen or on the page, is based on archaeology. And he wouldn't have that content if it wasn't for archaeologists. And this is, to me, a massive elephant in the room. The whole time he's trying to convince the viewer or the reader that traditional archaeology is bad, these are the evil ones, these are the guys we're fighting against. But a huge percentage of the information that he's drawing upon only exists thanks to archaeologists. You know, whether he's talking about Stonehenge or whether he's talking about the excavation of a new archaeological site in Turkey, which is very interesting by the way, or whether he's talking about teeth found in the early 20th century in a cave in Malta, all of these bits of evidence that he pulls on are archaeology. They have been found by archaeologists. Nobody else is out there digging up monuments in Turkey or analysing teeth from caves in Malta. These are, okay, very occasionally paleontologists when we're talking about fossil record stuff, but primarily these are archaeologists. So one of the problems with him painting this picture of him versus the establishment, and the establishment is the archaeologists, is a huge percentage of the evidence that he's using or manipulating or presenting comes from the archaeologists in the first place. If it weren't for them, he wouldn't have anything to talk about. Now, the next thing which really bugs me about Graham Hancock's position, his argument, his debating position, is that he complains about experts. And this is very much obviously related to the last point I made, but he says that we have an over-reliance on experts and that we need to draw upon a wider, more interdisciplinary and open-minded approach. Well, you know what? I disagree and I agree. So first of all, absolutely, any study of the past, whether you're primarily a historian, an archaeologist, or just a hobbyist sitting at home watching YouTube videos, you should draw upon multiple perspectives. And this is precisely what archaeology and history does. Okay, so historians look at all of the historians that have written about a topic previously, and they look at the primary source material, and they consult experts in related fields that might relate to that particular thing that they're looking at, whether it's military, economic, political, religious, whatever. Okay, so absolutely, archaeology and history by their very nature are interdisciplinary. Perhaps they can be more so, and in fact I would argue, yes, they can be more so. I'll come back to that point in a second. But the fact that we shouldn't rely on experts is complete bunkum. They're the very people we should rely on, because if I want to find out how to learn to use a longbow, if I want to learn how to use a longbow to go hunting in the woods of you know, out in the wilderness, who am I going to consult? Well, I'm going to consult somebody who knows how to use longbows to hunt in the wilderness. Do I make it up for myself? No. If I want to learn a car, who do I go to? I go to a driving instructor. If I want to learn how to strip and clean and restore a rifle, who do I consult? Someone who knows about rifles. So we absolutely must consult experts. And the other irony of him making this argument is that he himself does that. Now, I said I was going to come back to this point just so it doesn't look like I'm completely anti-Graham Hancock and pro-archaeology. I've got a criticism for archaeology and historians here as well, in that very often they don't rely enough on experts. What do I mean? Well, quite simply, when you're an archaeologist, and I've been an archaeologist, and certainly I was an archaeology student, and for a short time an archaeologist, and I know lots of archaeologists, very often my belief is they don't rely enough on experts in topics relating to the thing that they are studying. What do I mean by that? Well, archaeologists often write things, they often write reports, and sometimes they publish books about things such as warfare, how weapons are used, and that's something obviously which has touched a lot in my life, and I'll come back to that point. Sometimes to do with buildings, sometimes to do with animal husbandry or animal processing for food, the manufacture of clothes, the manufacture of tools, the use of tools, shipbuilding. So many different things, and in fairness, archaeologists do try, okay, and there are archaeologists who go out there and they do experimental archaeology. You know, they get a Bronze Age sword and a shield and they have a little play and they come to some conclusions based on that, or they butcher a rabbit using flint flakes, for example, and learn something to do with that, or they practice weaving using traditional looms and all of this kind of stuff. So absolutely, archaeology does try. I would say on the whole, historians try less. There are a number of very eminent historians who I've read or listened to audiobooks of in the last few years who have touched on topics that I happen to know things about, things to do with warfare or arms and armour, for example, and other things outside of that as well, where they have said things. These are very, I'm not going to name them here, but these are very respected historians, and they have written things which are abso-effing-lutely totally wrong, because they have obviously spoken to someone or read something and misunderstood how certain weapons or arms and armour were either manufactured or used. And they've written complete and utter horse beep on this topic. Why even include it in your book if you don't know what you're talking about? That's my view. So historians are very guilty of this quite often, Particularly in my world, I often experience this to do with military history and arms and armour. But if we take it to a broader topic, whether it's to do with clothes or whether it's to do with food processing, hunting, shipbuilding, castle building, house building, all sorts of things like this, I am certain that this relates to other fields. So one of my criticisms would be that historians in particular, but also to some degree archaeologists, should rely more on experts and bring in more external expert experience and knowledge, rather than rushing to publish something and write something about what you can learn from wounds from battlefield skeletons, for example, with only having a very superficial understanding or knowledge of the topic. And even I've done a number of videos recently about arrowheads, and when I've been reading what certain archaeologists and historians have written about arrowheads, there's a classic example right there of where very often archaeologists and historians don't have a bloody clue what they're talking about, because they don't understand anything about longbows, the making of arrows. Even in some cases, they haven't looked at the primary evidence for royal proclamations about how arrows should be made, supplied, and everything else. And so essentially they've got a lack of evidence. They're speaking from a point of ignorance. So archaeologists, historians, this is my call to you, lean more heavily on the real experts. You can't be a jack of all, well, you can try and be a jack of all trades, but you'll fail at being an expert, therefore, on things where you could rely on experts to get a better understanding and knowledge of the topic. Now, coming back to Graham Hancock, another thing which really bugs me about his criticism of archaeologists and historians is he has a tendency of painting them as a monolithic, to use a word that comes up a lot in his works, to use them as one body of people who are all in agreement with each other and all opposed to everything that he says. Okay, now anyone who makes kind of outlandish or kind of far out claims usually mixes up some things which are factual, some things which are slightly speculative, with things which are highly speculative or completely made up bollocks. Okay, and that's how you package a believable product. Okay, if I'm trying to sell something to you which is a scam, or if I'm trying to make you believe in a essentially fantasy history, then the best way to sell it is to mix up the false with the true, because then your brain gets so you think, oh well, he said that stuff which I know is true, and I said this stuff which certainly sounds plausible, and he said this stuff which at first I didn't believe, but all that other stuff he said, well, some of that I know is true and some of it's probably true, so this stuff might be true as well. That's how you sell a scam, okay, is you mix in the obviously true with the possibly true with the definitely not true, and therefore you sell the definitely not true as more believable. And my belief is primarily this is some of what Graham Hancock does, and this is why traditional archaeology hates him, according to him. However, here's my counterpoint. Archaeology is not one big group of people who are all in agreement. Historians are not one big group of people who are all in agreement. If you read books about the Third Crusade, or if you read books about Stonehenge, or you read books about Sutton Hoo, if you read books about the Migration era or the Viking era, things which I've had to read a lot of in my academic and since life, these are subjects where you'll find different points of view, okay? Historians love to argue with each other. They are argumentative people. Archaeologists are people who love to come up with theories, and very often those theories are completely butt up against and conflict with other archaeologists' theories. They would argue, oh yes, but they are based on evidence, we're just interpreting the evidence in different ways. Yeah, okay, so you might be using the same evidence, but the devil's in the detail, and interpretation is often what matters. So, a fundamental example. When I was at university, I studied the migration period. Okay, so this is the period in which, if you read, let's say, Victorian and Edwardian era books, most people would say that there were Germanic and Slavic migrations, and the Goths, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, various groups of Slavs and various groups of Germanic peoples migrated more or less westward. No one quite knows exactly why, after the fall of the Roman Empire, and basically created the nucleus, the basis of the countries that we live in today. Okay, so the Franks moved to France, the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes moved to England, you know, the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths moved into Italy and Spain, the Slavs moved down into northern Greece, Macedonia and places like this. So fundamentally, when I was studying archaeology, there was a period when lots of archaeologists were writing counter theories about the migrations of people. And bear in mind that when I was at university in the 90s, we were starting to have the beginnings of DNA analysis of modern populations. And this gave rise to two camps. The camp of people who said, oh, well, in most places it was just a tiny ruling elite who came in and the population didn't change. And then the other camp who said, no, there was ethnic cleansing and massive population change. And there were some people in the middle, but there were essentially two opposing camps of thought. So I'm not going to go into, I mean, maybe we'll look at the migration era in more depth in a future video. And I was very much brought up because depending on which your university is and who your lecturers and who your professors are, you will tend to be educated in one camp or the other. This means that when archaeologists go out into the world as grown-ups and as professionals, they have an inherent bias because of where they were educated and where their degree comes from. So I was very much where I went to UCL at the Institute of Archaeology, and my professors were very much strongly in the old-fashioned migration of populations school of thought. However, if you studied under someone like Francis Pryor, he is very much of the school of thought of the population of Britain hasn't really changed, and we're talking about tiny migrations of ruling elite. So depending who you studied under, you will have an inherent bias. Even if you change your mind in the future, that is the lineage, that's the lineage of school of thought that you come from. So to counter Graham Hancock's stances and assertions, I would say don't ever paint archaeology or historians as having one school of thought, one group of people, this is the wall, this is what we need to break down. It's just not like that. The fact is you've got different theories, different ideas, and very often over the course of years and decades, for example, when I was at university, everyone was saying based on the DNA that we have available, modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, didn't mix with Neanderthals. We now know they definitely did. So in 25 years, thanks to science, our knowledge completely changes, and we now know that everybody living north of the Sahara has Neanderthal blood in them, basically. So I'm part Neanderthal, most of you are part Neanderthal as well. However, when I was at university, we were told categorically, no, we're not part Neanderthal at all. So sometimes time can change it. So sometimes politics, time, sometimes just, you know, theories develop. So absolutely these ideas can change, and absolutely we can have sometimes two opposing camps or sometimes multiple opposing camps within archaeology or history. So to conclude, fundamentally I disagree with a huge number of things that Graham Hancock asserts. Not talking about his theories about Ice Age civilizations or the Antarctic being shown on Renaissance maps or anything like this. I'm not going to get into that right now. If there's an appetite to, maybe I will in the future. What I fundamentally disagree with Graham Hancock about is, number one, that he paints archaeologists as the enemy. No, don't make archaeologists your enemy, Graham, because you need them, because most of your theories and evidence come from them, okay? If you estrange yourself utterly and completely and cut yourself off from the people digging in the ground, how are you ever going to get new evidence to support your theories, okay? So make friends with the archaeologists, get them on side and see what they think. Include them a bit more in what you do, because you're already doing it, so you may as well openly admit that you're using their evidence that they're finding and finding new sites like the one in Turkey, and bring them into the fold, as it were, and embrace what they can bring, okay? That's the first thing. The second thing is, archaeologists and historians are not one entity. They don't have one theory. They have multiple different theories, and there's all sorts of different theories to do with Stonehenge or whatever else you want to focus on, okay? Lastly, this is where I don't entirely disagree with Graham Hancock, and that is that I do believe we should be having more interdisciplinary approach to history and archaeology. And that's what I do on this channel. I bring in primary sources, I bring in physical experimental archaeology. I use the fact that I've got 25 years of sword fighting and martial arts to apply to my interpretation of historical sources or artwork, whatever. So absolutely, and linked to that, very strongly linked to that, if you believe in an interdisciplinary approach, don't say that there's too much reliance on experts. We don't need less reliance on experts, we need more experts and more reliance on experts. And this is where my criticism is to both Graham Hancock and archaeology, and particularly historians. Graham Hancock, archaeologists, historians, you all need to rely more on experts. If you want to know more about masonry or hunting or martial arts or any specific thing, you need to rely more on the experts that know the most about those things. Don't just think that just because you're a historian, arrogantly think you know how Saladin's armies precisely operated based on some primary source material you've got. Actually consult more with military experts, martial artists, arms and armour makers, antique dealers as well, very good source of knowledge. So, more reliance on experts is a good thing. Not less reliance on experts. Don't run towards ignorance, run towards knowledge and science. I hope this has been an off-topic and interesting foray into a different aspect, I guess, of this channel. And yeah, you know, I do talk about history and archaeology all the time on this channel. It's usually focused on arms and armour and martial arts. But this has been perhaps a little bit broader thinking for the beginning of the new year. If you want to see more general archaeology and history content, post below. If you've got your own personal thoughts on traditional archaeology or historians, or indeed Graham Hancock and his theories, again, feel free to post below. Thanks a lot for watching. Please give me a like if you've watched this far to the video. And if you're not subscribed, please consider doing so. I hope I'll see you again really, really soon. Cheers, folks.